So I'm talking from home tonight. There's no grand wall of old books behind me. The gallery in Manhattan is closed because of Corona. And it's back to homeschooling. I thought there's probably no better book to think about homeschooling than a 1579 copy of Roger Ascham's Schoolmaster. Roger Ascham was the tutor to Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I. So if you're going to do homeschooling, you better start with the Queen's tutor. The book itself is called The Schoolmaster, or Plain and Perfect Way of Teaching Children to Understand, Write, and Speak the Latin Tongue, but especially for the private bringing up of youth and gentlemen and noblemen's houses. Princess Elizabeth originally had another tutor, William Grindal, and speaking of plagues, he himself succumbed to a plague in 1548 that swept through England, and he was replaced by Roger Ascham, his mentor. Roger Ascham continued the princess's education. She was an extraordinarily precocious student, a very intelligent girl, if not brilliant, and by the time her formal education ended in 1550, she was already speaking Latin and Greek, Italian and French, and I'm sure numerous other dialects in the area. The book is quite interesting. It's actually broken up into two parts. The second part is the ready way to the Latin tongue, or reading Latin. And the first part is more about the psychology and technique of education. So that's of particular interest to me. You can imagine during this period to get children to learn. There were a lot of harsh techniques, including many beatings and everything else, those young minds. But Roger Ascham was completely against those techniques. He decried them in this work. And obviously he wanted to use the carrot over the stick. And he writes here about the gentleness in teaching and the importance of that. He says, if a school or a student do miss sometimes, as all students do, in marking rightly, chide not hastily, for that shall both dull his wit and discourage his diligence. So the last thing we want to do is to discourage the diligence of children. So that was an extraordinarily progressive thing for the time. Now, of course, you still had to learn Latin from Livy and Cicero, and theology from the Lutheran reformer Philip Melanchthon. So I don't know how progressive in terms of at least Montessori, Reggio, playing with blocks and art that was. But it was certainly progressive for the period. Also because Roger Ascham taught not only Princess Elizabeth, but as well as Lady Jane Grey and Queen Mary. He was at the forefront of women's education, so it's a very important book as well for the beginnings of women's formal education. Speaking of women, as I said, this book is published in 1579. The first edition was published in 1570. So when this edition was published, Shakespeare was 15 years old or so, so he certainly could have used a book like this. But Roger Ascham himself died in 1568, so it was published 2 years after his death. And his wife, Margaret Ascham, inherited the unfinished manuscript, and she finished it, she raised the money, and she brought the project to fruition and printed the book, and she signed her name in the epistle at the end. It says here, "Your humble Margaret Ascham." So that is very unusual for its time to see some writing and a woman's name in print, but that again goes along with, I'm sure, Roger Ascham's interest in female education, and you would expect nothing less from his wife to continue in that spirit. Now, in terms of evaluating the book, I always look at the physical characteristics for the book. This is not an original 16th century binding. This looks like a late 19th century binding, maybe turn of the century. One of the things I really like to look at very closely are any old notes on the flyleaves from booksellers, old auctions, provenance. And here is a particularly fun one. It is in an old hand, and it's quoting from Dibdin's Bibliomania. Bibliomania is a very famous work published in 1809 by Thomas Frogwell Dibdin, and it purported to be a work on book madness. What it did for sure was excite general curiosity in antiquarian old volumes, and during the first part of the 19th century, just because of that book, a lot of collectors came into the field, and it really pushed the prices up at auction. Nowhere near where they are today, but for the 19th century, books were also getting quite expensive because of Dibdin. And one of the fun lines he quotes here, he says, as Dibdin says about this work, his Schoolmaster is a work which can only perish with our language. Now, that seems quite harsh. I don't know really what Dibdin meant by that. Perhaps he was talking about the growing importance of English over Latin, or that schooling in the 19th century had advanced considerably since Elizabethan times. But by modern standards, this work, the Schoolmaster, has a lot of importance because it really gives us insight into the 16th century and Elizabethan period. So one of the next things I have to do is check if the book is complete. Now, you can go up on ESTC, the English Short Title Catalog. I'll include that in the information below, and that is a very useful catalog of early English imprints before 1800. And we are looking for the collation of the work, and we want to count the pages. And when we do so, we look at the signatures, which for the last signature here, they were made by the printer for the binder. It says T1, T2, T3, and then T4 is unfortunately missing. The work itself ends fini, but T4 contained a simple printer's mark, so we are missing formally the last page of the book. Because it's not a text leaf, it's just the printer's mark. I don't consider that a fatal flaw, but it is quite undesirable. You do want all of the pages there. Then we can go onto a site. We can look up old auction records. I generally like Rare Book Hub. I've mentioned it before. And if you go onto Rare Book Hub, I think from memory, I can check now as we're doing the video, there is a auction record from about the year 2000 for about £900. And the book was also missing that last leaf with the printer's mark. That is something common because a lot of times when the book was rebound, that wasn't an important leaf, so they just removed it. But that auction record is quite comparable for £900 at auction in the year 2000. Of course, that's 20 years ago already. Time really flies. And it's a question of what is the book worth today. I would say there's increasing interest in Elizabethan imprints, and I would put the book somewhere between $2,000, $2,500, something in that range at least. One more interesting thing I would like to talk about with respect to the work is the general idea of collecting. Because people always come to me and they say, well, we don't know where to start, what to collect. I always say, go buy one interesting book. And the reason I say that is because that often leads into different directions. Say you had gone out and you had spent some money and you had bought a copy of the Schoolmaster from 1579. And you can read it and enjoy it. And it's like a tree with many branches. It might lead you down to collecting books of the Elizabethan period. It might lead you down to collecting books printed during Shakespeare's lifetime. It might lead you down the path of female education if you wanted to collect that. It might lead you down the path of general education. One more, perhaps, path it could lead you down is going back to Dibdin's Bibliomania. He specifically talks about Roger Ascham as suffering from the madness of books. He had gone to Europe and he had bought very fine copies of the classics, and he filled his entire house with them. So this is a book written by a true bibliomaniac. There are other books written by bibliomaniacs, whether it's Erasmus or other people like that. So you could even collect books that were authored by people who suffered from a sort of book madness. So that is my talk on Ascham's Schoolmaster. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that everybody is safe, healthy, well, and there'll be better times in the very near future. And I hope you subscribe and follow me for more interesting things about the antiquarian book trade.